The wind whispered through the cracks in Thornwood House's window panes, carrying with it the chill of a Maine November. Jonathan Miller shivered, pulling his cardigan tighter around his lean frame. At 42, his face bore the etchings of solitude rather than age, each line a testament to years spent in self-imposed isolation. He glanced at the grandfather clock in the hallway. Its steady ticking had been his constant companion since inheriting the house 5 years ago. Tick, tock, tick, tock. Each second seemed to stretch, pulling taut the silence that blanketed the old house. Jonathan's eyes drifted to the framed photograph on his desk, himself as a boy, flanked by his parents. His father's stern visage stared back at him, a silent reproach even from beyond the grave. "I'm trying, Dad," Jonathan muttered, his voice barely audible above the clock's relentless rhythm. "I'm trying to understand." He turned his attention back to the leather-bound journal before him, his father's last bequest. The spidery handwriting sprawled across the yellowed pages, a maze of half-formed thoughts and cryptic references. Jonathan had spent countless nights poring over the journal, searching for, what? Understanding? Forgiveness? A reason for the gulf that had grown between them in those final years? A sudden gust of wind rattled the windows, making Jonathan start. He chuckled nervously, chiding himself for his jumpiness. "Get a grip, John," he murmured. "It's just an old house settling." But was it? In the 5 years since he'd moved into Thornwood House, Jonathan had grown accustomed to its quirks, the creaking floorboards, the drafty corridors, the shadows that seemed to linger just a bit too long in the corners. Yet lately, there had been something else. A presence, perhaps? A weight in the air that pressed down on him, making each breath a conscious effort. He shook his head, trying to dispel the fanciful thoughts. This isolation was getting to him. Maybe he should call Sarah, his sister. How long had it been since they'd spoken? Weeks? Months? As if in response to his thoughts, a shrill sound pierced the silence, causing Jonathan to nearly leap out of his chair. The old rotary phone on the wall, a relic he'd kept out of some misplaced sense of nostalgia, was ringing. Jonathan stared at the phone, his heart pounding in his chest. It wasn't possible. The line had been disconnected years ago, hadn't it? Yet there it was, its black receiver trembling with each insistent ring. Slowly, as if in a trance, Jonathan rose and crossed the room. His hand hovered over the receiver, trembling slightly. The ringing seemed to grow louder, more urgent. With a deep breath, he lifted the receiver to his ear. "Hello," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Silence greeted him. Not the empty silence of a deadline, but a silence that felt alive, expectant. Jonathan strained to listen, desperate for any hint of sound. "Hello?" He tried again, louder this time. "Is anyone there?" A crackling sound came through the line, like static but somehow different. It ebbed and flowed, almost like breathing. And underneath it all, so faint he might have imagined it, Jonathan thought he heard a voice. "John, Ethan." He nearly dropped the phone. That voice, it couldn't be. "Dad," he gasped, gripping the receiver so tightly his knuckles turned white. The static grew louder, drowning out any response. Jonathan pressed the phone harder against his ear, as if he could force it to reveal its secrets through sheer will. "Dad, is that you? I can't hear you clearly. Please, if it's you, say something." The static reached a crescendo, and then, nothing. The line went dead, leaving Jonathan standing there, the silent receiver still clutched in his shaking hand. Slowly, he replaced the receiver in its cradle. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. It wasn't possible. His father was dead, had been for 5 years. And yet... Jonathan's eyes fell on the journal, still open on his desk. A chill ran down his spine as he noticed something he hadn't before. There, in the margin of the page he'd been reading, was a hastily scrawled note. "The lines are open. They're calling. God help us all. He stumbled back to his chair, collapsing into it as the weight of realization settled over him. The phone call, his father's journal, the oppressive atmosphere of Thornwood House, they were all connected. And Jonathan had a sinking feeling that this was only the beginning. As if to confirm his fears, the lights in the study flickered, casting dancing shadows across the walls. In that moment, Jonathan understood with terrifying clarity that Thornwood House was more than just an old family home. It was awake, aware, and it had been waiting for him. The grandfather clock in the hallway struck midnight, its chimes echoing through the house like a funeral knell. And as the final note faded away, Jonathan could have sworn he heard, just on the edge of perception, the sound of a phone beginning to ring. Hashtag the whispers in the wires, refined. The following days blurred together for Jonathan, each one a haze of sleepless nights and paranoid days. The phone remained stubbornly silent, but its presence loomed large in his mind, a constant reminder of that impossible call. On the third day, as weak sunlight struggled to penetrate the perpetual gloom that seemed to hang over Thornwood House, Jonathan's cell phone buzzed. He nearly jumped out of his skin at the sound, fumbling with the device before answering. "Hello," he said, his voice hoarse from disuse. "John? It's Sarah. Are you okay? I've been trying to reach you for days." Jonathan closed his eyes, relief washing over him at the sound of his sister's voice. "Sarah, I'm fine. Just been busy, that's all." There was a pause on the other end of the line. When Sarah spoke again, her voice was laced with concern. "You don't sound fine, John. What's going on?" He opened his mouth to reassure her, to brush off her worries with a casual lie. But the words stuck in his throat. How could he explain what was happening when he barely understood it himself? It's the house, Sarah," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Something's not right here." "What do you mean?" Sarah's tone sharpened. "John, you're scaring me." Jonathan ran a hand through his disheveled hair, struggling to find the words. "I got a call on the old phone. The one that's not even connected. I thought I heard Dad's voice." The silence that followed was deafening. When Sarah finally spoke, her voice was carefully neutral. "John, Dad's been gone for 5 years. You know that's not possible." "I know how it sounds, but..." "No. Listen to me," Sarah cut him off. "I'm worried about you. You've been cooped up in that house for too long. Why don't you come stay with me for a while? Get away from there. Clear your head." Jonathan's gaze drifted to his father's journal, still open on the desk. "I can't leave, Sarah. Not yet. There's something I need to figure out." Sarah sighed, a sound heavy with frustration and worry. "John, please, don't do this. Don't go down this road again." Her words hit Jonathan like a physical blow, dredging up memories he'd long tried to suppress. The arguments with their father, the accusations, the gradual disintegration of their family in the wake of their mother's death. He'd promised himself he wouldn't become like his father, obsessed with the house and its secrets. But here he was, following the same path. "I'm sorry, Sarah," he said softly. "I have to do this. I'll call you soon, okay?" He ended the call before she could respond, guilt gnawing at him. But he pushed it aside. There would be time for explanations later. Right now, he had work to do. Jonathan turned back to the journal, determination setting his jaw. For hours, he pored over the pages, cross-referencing entries, looking for patterns. As the day wore on and shadows lengthened across the study, something began to take shape. References to the lines peppered the journal, growing more frequent in later entries. His father wrote of whispers in the wires, of a presence that reached out through the phone lines. And beneath it all, a sense of growing dread, of a reckoning long delayed, but finally at hand. As Jonathan flipped to the final entry, a small brass key fell from between the pages. He picked it up, turning it over in his hand. It was old, its surface dulled with age and etched with unfamiliar symbols. A memory stirred in the recesses of his mind, his mother's voice, stern and worried. "Promise me you'll never go into the attic, Jonathan. It's not safe up there." He'd always assumed it was because of the rickety stairs or the possibility of wasps' nests. Now, with the weight of the key in his palm and the phantom ring of the phone still echoing in his ears, Jonathan wondered if there had been more to her warning. Night had fallen by the time Jonathan stood before the attic door, key in hand. The house seemed to hold its breath as he inserted the key into the lock. It turned with a sound like breaking bones. The attic air was thick with dust and the musty scent of age. Jonathan's flashlight beam cut through the gloom, revealing stacks of moldering boxes and sheet-draped furniture. But it was what stood in the far corner that drew his attention. An antique roll-top desk, its surface scarred and stained, stood partially hidden behind a stack of trunks. Jonathan approached it slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. The key fit perfectly into the desk's lock. Inside, he found a treasure trove of the bizarre and unsettling. Faded photographs of stern-faced ancestors, their eyes seeming to follow him as he moved. Newspaper clippings detailing mysterious disappearances and unexplained phenomena in the town of Blackmore dating back over a century. And at the bottom of the central drawer, a leather-bound ledger, its pages yellow with age. Jonathan's breath caught in his throat as he opened the ledger. The handwriting was familiar, the same spidery script he'd seen in his father's journal. But these entries dated back to the late 1800s, penned by a great-great-grandfather he'd never known existed. As he read, a chill settled deep in his bones. The ledger spoke of a presence in the house, an entity that reached out through the telegraph lines. It whispered secrets, promised power, demanded sacrifice. With each generation, it grew stronger, its influence spreading through the nascent telephone networks. His ancestors had struck a bargain with this entity, trading the souls of Blackmore's unwary for prosperity and longevity. The price of breaking this pact was hinted at in the ledger's final, frantic entry, "It comes for us all in the end." The wires sing with its hunger. "God forgive us for what we've done." A sudden crash from downstairs tore Jonathan from his reading. Heart pounding, he crept down the attic stairs and through the shadowy hallway. As he approached his study, he heard a sound that turned his blood to ice, the distinct, mechanical whir of a rotary dial being turned. Jonathan burst into the room, flashlight beam dancing wildly across the walls. The phone hung innocently on the wall, silent and still. But as he approached, he noticed something that made his breath catch in his throat. The layer of dust on the rotary dial was disturbed, as if someone or something had just used it. As he stood there, staring at the phone, a realization dawned on him, terrible in its clarity. He wasn't just living in a house with a dark history. He was living in a house that was awake, aware, and hungry. The ledger had mentioned a hidden room, a sanctum where the rituals that fed the entity were performed. With shaking hands, Jonathan began to search the study, running his fingers along the edges of bookshelves, feeling for hidden catches or secret panels. As his hand brushed against a particular section of wainscoting, he felt it give slightly. There was a soft click, and a portion of the wall swung inward, revealing a narrow passageway that seemed to pulse with an otherworldly light. Jonathan stood at the threshold, the weight of generations of secrets bearing down on him. The passageway beckoned, promising answers, but also untold horrors. As he took his first step into the unknown, the phone began to ring once more, its shrill cry echoing through the house like a warning or an invitation. In that moment, Jonathan understood that he stood at a crossroads. He could turn back, flee the house and the legacy it represented. Or he could press on, delving deeper into the mystery that had claimed his family for generations. The choice, he realized, was an illusion. He had been part of this story since before he was born, a player in a game whose rules he was only beginning to understand. With a deep breath, Jonathan stepped into the passageway, the wall sliding shut behind him with a finality that spoke of paths chosen and fates sealed. As he descended into the pulsing heart of Thornwood House, the phone's ringing faded, replaced by a low, persistent hum that seemed to come from the very walls themselves. Whatever awaited him in the depths of the house, Jonathan knew that his life would never be the same. The wires were singing, and this time, he had no choice but to answer their call. Jonathan's hands trembled as he stood before the hidden passageway, the old brass key cool against his palm. The attic's musty air seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy, and for a moment, he considered turning back. His sister Sarah's words echoed in his mind. "Don't lose yourself in there, John. Remember who you are." With a deep breath, he inserted the key into the lock. It turned with a grinding reluctance, as if the house itself was trying to keep its secrets. The door swung open, revealing a narrow staircase that spiraled down into darkness. As Jonathan descended, the air grew thick and oppressive. The walls seemed to close in, slick with a film of oily moisture that glistened in the beam of his flashlight. With each step, a low, pulsing hum grew stronger, vibrating through his bones and setting his teeth on edge. At the bottom of the stairs, the passage opened into a vast, circular chamber. Jonathan's breath caught in his throat as he took in the sight before him. The room was filled with an impossible tangle of wires, tubes, and antiquated machinery. At its center stood a monstrous contraption that defied description, part telephone exchange, part arcane altar. As he approached, transfixed, the machine sprung to life. Lights flickered across its surface in dizzying patterns, and the hum rose to a deafening pitch. Then, impossibly, voices began to emanate from the wires. Thousands of them, overlapping and intertwining whispers, screams, pleas, and threats. "Welcome, heir of Thornwood," a chilling voice cut through the cacophony, speaking directly into Jonathan's mind. "We've been waiting for you." The entity, for Jonathan now understood that's what it was, began to explain. It was a being of pure energy, ancient beyond human comprehension. It had latched onto the first electric currents humans had sent through wires, growing stronger with each technological advance. The Millers had been its unwitting servants for generations, their fear and guilt feeding it, their sacrifices expanding its reach. "Your ancestors tried to break free," the voice continued, a note of cruel amusement in its tone. "But the price was too high. Now you must choose. Serve willingly and know power beyond your wildest dreams. Refuse and watch as I devour everything you hold dear." As if to emphasize its point, phones throughout the house began to ring. Each ring reverberated through Jonathan's body, and with each sound, he saw flashes of the entity's influence, accidents caused by phantom calls, lives ruined by whispered secrets, souls lost to promises of power. Jonathan's mind reeled. The weight of generations pressed down upon him, the sins of his ancestors crying out for atonement. He thought of Sarah, of the town above, unaware of the malevolence that lurked beneath their feet, spreading through their phone lines and internet cables. In that moment, Jonathan made his choice. "No," he said, his voice barely a whisper at first, then gaining strength. "No, this ends now." The entity's laughter filled the chamber, a sound of grinding metal and crackling electricity. "You are nothing," it hissed. "A speck, a mote of dust. What hope do you have against me?" Jonathan closed his eyes, centering himself. He thought of his father, consumed by guilt and fear. He thought of all those who had suffered because of this entity's influence. And he thought of Sarah, her voice a lifeline in the darkness. "I am Jonathan Miller," he said, each word a declaration of defiance. "I am not my father, not my grandfather, not any of those who came before. I am myself, and I choose to break the cycle." With a primal yell that tore from the depths of his soul, Jonathan lunged at the machine. His hands closed around wires, ripping and tearing. The entity's scream of rage filled his head, threatening to split his skull. Sparks flew as Jonathan continued his frenzied assault, heedless of the electricity coursing through his body. The chamber began to shake, dust and debris raining down from the ceiling. The entity's fury manifested in a maelstrom of energy that whipped around the room. Jonathan stood at the eye of the storm, his body racked with pain, but his resolve unshaken. As he pulled the final cable free, there was a moment of absolute silence. Then, with a deafening roar, the machine exploded in a blinding flash of light. Jonathan was thrown back, his world dissolving into darkness. When he came to, Jonathan found himself lying on the floor of his study. Weak sunlight filtered through the dusty windows, suggesting he had been unconscious for hours. His body ached, and angry red welts crisscrossed his hands where he had grasped the wires. The house was silent. Not the oppressive, watching silence of before, but a peaceful quiet that spoke of burdens lifted and ancient evils put to rest. The old phone on the wall hung limply, its cord severed and its dial cracked. Jonathan struggled to his feet, his legs unsteady. He made his way to the window, looking out over the town of Blackmore. The sun was rising, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold. For the first time since he'd returned to Thornwood House, Jonathan felt a sense of peace settle over him. The battle was won, but he knew his work was far from over. The entity might be gone, but its effects lingered. There were wounds to heal, truths to be revealed, and a legacy to reckon with. As if on cue, his cell phone rang. Sarah's name flashed on the screen. "John? Are you okay?" Her voice was thick with worry. "I've been trying to reach you all night." Jonathan smiled, feeling the weight of secrets lift from his shoulders. "I'm okay, Sarah," he said, "and I have quite a story to tell you." As he began to recount the events of the night, Jonathan knew that the road ahead would not be easy. But as he stood there, watching the sun rise over Blackmore, he felt ready to face whatever came next. The whispers in the wires had been silenced, and a new chapter was about to begin.